A couple of years ago, I was asked to give a presentation at the reopening of a women's shelter in Utrecht, which is where I teach. And this shelter is called Meisjesstad, City of Girls. It's a somewhat frivolous, if not infantilizing name for such a place. In preparation, I went to talk with several of the women who had been living in that shelter for a month. And what struck me was the matter-of-factness with which many women spoke about their having been physically or mentally abused by their male partners. As if it were a fact of life, natural, as if it were natural, as in being in the nature of men and thus to be born and tolerated by women. It also struck me that many women were making excuses for their partner's violence, and some women even evinced a feeling of guilt, as if it were their fault that they had, through their own behavior, provoked their partner into beating them. In addition, there was also an almost ineradicable hope that it would eventually be possible to go back to him, that things would return to being as they had been before, that he would indeed never hit them again. I was deeply shaken by my visits to the shelter, both because of how the women reacted to gender violence, but also because of the statistics that kept popping up in my mind about how small the chances are that a beating remains an incident. I also became convinced of how important it is to share widely the insights that the feminist movement has produced over the past 4 decades on gendered violence. To share these with both men and women, and it also seemed to me that it was equally important to start again with consciousness-raising issues in shelters about violence. That is something, that is a form that the second feminist wave has introduced, consciousness-raising, and I think we should go back to those sessions, to those forms of sharing knowledge and experiences, and also that education about gender in primary and high school, everywhere, should be mandatory. I'm borrowing Malcolm X's words, "by any means necessary," in my title to indicate the urgency with which we need to combat and resist the violence that is committed against women on a daily basis. So what kinds of violence am I thinking about? Women are suffering from physical, sexual, psychological/emotional and epistemic violence, and often it's a combination of all of them. In the Krachenburg case of the African women that I mentioned earlier, it's very hard to disentangle the various strands. The beatings, the enforced sexual acts, the humiliation and threats, and finally the total disregard of the perpetrators for what the African women were feeling and thinking. And the perpetrators were turning the women's position into one of consent and even pleasure. I didn't hear any of them crying or screaming, one of the convicted men said, even though the women were vomiting from fear and misery. I've turned the latter aspect, that is that the knowledge that women carry is disregarded and is even used against them, epistemic violence. So I will, in my talk, with the help of the concepts of gender and especially race, ethnicity, and a little bit of class, I will show how these various axes of signification interact with the phenomenon of violence against women. This is not the best way to do this. I have a PowerPoint here that is working with fading, and I don't like it one bit. But anyway, that's the way it is. So I'm going to continue to talk about gender. First, gender. That is our first concept. Yes. This concept can help us understand the overwhelming presence of women in shelters as the objects of gendered violence. By gender, I mean the complex social system that gives meaning to biological masculinity and femininity. After all, as Simone de Beauvoir already said in The Second Sex, we are not born as men and women, we are made into them. We have to reflect for a moment why it is predominantly women who need shelter due to violence in their relationships, due to abuse and due to marriage and relationship problems. And while I'm aware of the danger of essentialism, and I do not want to incarcerate women and children always in less robust bodies, it often is the case that men, also by their gendered socialization and training, are physically on average more sturdy, they're more strong, and thus do not have as much to fear from women and children as the other way around. So we're confronted here with a human read masculine flaw. At the shelter in Utrecht that I visited, about 70% of women were seeking shelter because of real or threatened violence from their male partners. So we get an image of a society that, while verbally embracing gender equality and even characterizing itself when it comes to the dominant white population as the epitome of emancipation, that this society actually has a gender system that heavily works to the detriment of women, that women structurally find themselves in positions where they meet violence. In the Netherlands, generally 1/3 of women has been the victim of sexual violence, and 12% has ever been raped in their lives. As I indicated before, generally we treat violence against women and children as a force of nature, as an inevitability, as the way things unfortunately are, while it's an international disgrace in my eyes. This behavior, both on the part of men and of women, is learned, and thus it can also be unlearned. Okay, so now moving on to the situation in Estonia, I read up on the history and the social circumstances, and I came into some disconcerting and worrying findings on the basis of some national and international reports. These data are, even though they are very few, those that are available are rather ominous. In the 2009 Human Rights Report on Estonia, issued by the Bureau of Democracy and dates from March 11, 2010, we can read that problems were reported in several areas. So there are general problems, and I will make that link a little bit later. There were allegations that police used excessive force and verbal abuse during the arrest of suspects. Conditions in detention centers generally remained poor. So note that I'm mentioning violent state practices. In addition, domestic violence, inequality of women's salaries, child abuse and trafficking of women were also reported. Although women have the same legal rights as men under the law and are entitled to equal pay for equal work, these rights are not always observed in practice. The average educational level of women is higher than that of men, but women's average pay is generally lower, and there continue to be female and male-dominated professions. According to government statistics, the difference between the salaries of men and women was 30% in 2007. Violence against women, including spousal abuse, is a serious problem. According to NGOs, 1 woman in 4 has suffered physical, sexual, or emotional domestic violence. Okay, the longevity, persistence, seriousness and casualness characterizing Estonian gendered violence brought the situation of South Africa during apartheid to my mind. In a society that had for decades sighed under apartheid, the violence exercised by the state had become the standard way of solving problems. Violence permeated and permeates the fabric of society from the highest circle to the lowest, becoming evident also on the micro level in the relations between people, between men on the one hand, leading to extraordinary levels of homicide, and between men and women on the other hand, evident in gendered violence. So I'm speaking about South Africa and the way that state violence has permeated the whole fabric of society. Another way of saying that is that under some circumstances, violence may become such a hardcore structural feature of society that it is hard for those who are insiders to even discern its pervasiveness and intensity. It is a feature that is transmitted between generations. Between generations and within genders. For men as the way to dominate the other gender, or seeking a scapegoat for their own personal frustrations in an object that is relatively harmless and that won't retaliate. For women, it has been inculcated by their socialization that they have to accept their submission. So what I'm doing here is, as on the first day, on Wednesday, the representative of the Green Party said we have to be looking for root causes of gendered violence. And I would suggest that delving into what it means to have been colonized for 7 centuries could be a very important part of the program that needs to be accomplished here in Estonia. I will do that later on for the Netherlands, but here I would just like to raise the questions, like what kind of psychic economy is produced during 700 years of being a colony? What are the feelings that are produced for men and for women in this situation? It would seem that while Professor Oaklund was talking about the legacy of Christianity that we all also carry with us, or many of us carry with us, we also have to look specifically at each individual society and look at what the cultural archive looks like. I will come back to that later.